Hello everyone, welcome back to Code with Nomi, and today we're going to learn how to build a fully functional app. We're going to implement authentication system and a messaging system in React Native, and for that we're going to use Firebase. We'll be using Expo router, latest Nativewind 4, vector icons, Lottie Animations, and so much more. On top of that, we'll be also making our app responsive so that the UI looks good on all the devices. So if you're new to Expo Router or React Native, then this is a good start to master your skills in React Native. And with that said, let me show you the demo of the app. So when you start the application, the first thing you'll see is the sign in and sign up pages. And I'm currently running the app on iOS and Android devices, so you get the idea of how the app is responsive on both the devices. And on the sign up page, I've already implemented the keyboard avoiding view. So if we have a lot of inputs on a screen, that won't be a problem. Our keyboard will not be covering the inputs, so you can scroll through all the inputs. So let's go ahead and create a new account, John Wick at the rate gmail.com, and let's create a password. And for the last field, we're going to add a link of the image. I've already opened an image, so let me just copy and paste the link for that and hit sign up. Okay, so we are signed up, and the first thing we'll see is a list of all the users in the application. And on the header, if we click on our icon, we will see a context menu where we'll see two options: to visit our profile or to sign out the application. So let me sign into my other account and see how the messaging system works. Let's put the password and hit sign in. And we're logged in, so we'll get all the users in our application. So here you will notice one thing: we also see the last message and the time of the message. That's because if you already have conversed with the user, you will see the last messages and the date of the message. But if you haven't, you will see a suggestion saying hi to start the conversation. So if I open a user, we will see the message history with that user. And if we have a lot of messages in a chat history and we click on the type message, this will push all the messages to show the input on top of the keyboard. So let's go to our new user and send some messages. Let's say hi. And you will notice as soon as I click on the send icon, this will update the message in both the apps. So we got the message in message history, and we also got updated our chat list, and we are seeing the last message and the date of the message. So let's click on it, and we got the message history. Now let's send another message from John Wick. Hey man, how are you? And as soon as I click on the send icon, this gets updated on both the apps. So let's send some more messages. Let's say what's going on. And if I send, this appears on the other side. Let's say getting bored at home. What about you? And hit send. And we got the message. So let's reply same here. Let's send an emoji as well. Let's send this one and hit send, and we got our message. So this is how our chat system is working, and we can go back and see all the other users and we can chat with them. I've also implemented the keyboard avoiding view and it works great. So let me sign in with another account and show you what I mean. Let's sign in with Tom, add password and hit sign in. The keyboard avoiding view works really great in sign in and sign up, but one thing I really like is when we are in a chat where we have a lot of messages, and if we click on the input, it will push all the messages and it will still show the input on top of the keyboard. I really like how smooth it does that, and it's also implemented on the Android side. So if you open the same chat and if I click on the input, it will push all the messages and still show the input. And the last thing to show is this context menu which appears on top of everything. I haven't implemented the profile part, which I will leave up to you guys. So this was a brief overview of how this application is going to work, and if you are interested to build this application, we'll be building this application together. And if you find this video helpful, do like the video and subscribe the channel, because this really helps the channel to grow. And without further wasting any time, let's get started and build this application. So first of all, you need to go to Expo website, and on the sidebar you will see the installation tab. Just click on it, and here you'll find the quickest way to install an Expo app with tabs. And if you scroll down, you will see a manual setup process as well, but we're not going to follow this because this is very lengthy. We will stick with the quick method. So let's just copy this command and open the terminal. Let's paste it here, and this is going to ask us about the application name. Let's name it Firebase Chat, and this is going to install the application for us. So let's wait. Okay, it's finished. Now we can close the terminal and open the project into VS Code. I've already done that while it was being installed, so let me just drag the VS Code here. Let's make it full screen. Let's also drag my iOS simulator. Let's adjust them both in one window like this. Now, first of all, what we're gonna do is run our application to see how it looks like. So let's open the terminal and write the command npm run iOS. This is going to run the iOS version of our app. And here is the app directory of our application. We have app, assets, components, and the constants. We'll probably remove all of this code because we're going to build this application from scratch. So let's just wait. Okay, so the application is running, and as you can see, we have two tabs at the bottom. And if I click on this icon, this should open a model. So this is what you get when you install a new Expo router app. So let's remove all of this code. Let's select all of these tabs and remove them. And let's keep our assets, and we're not gonna use the components, all of these components. So let's just remove all of them. And let's keep our constants for now. So let me create the first component in app folder, and the Expo router works on file based routes. So if you are not familiar with the Expo router, then I'll suggest to watch my other video on Expo router. So let's just refresh. This error will go away. Okay, so we have our first component, and before we start designing this component, we need to install Nativewind to design our application. So let's go to Nativewind, and Nativewind basically uses Tailwind CSS, and we're going to install the Nativewind version 4, which is the latest version. So here is their documentation, and you need to click on Expo Router in the sidebar, and we're going to follow all of this to install it and set up this into our application. Let's stop our server. And first we need to install all of these libraries. Let's just copy this and paste it into the terminal. And then we need to install this command, and because I am not using React Native CLI, so I don't need to do this. Then we're gonna run this command to create a Tailwind configuration file. So let's just copy this command and paste it into the terminal. And this has created a Tailwind configuration file. We're going to change the contents of this file. So let me just copy the content and the preset property. Let's copy this and replace this into our configuration file. And this content property basically holds a list of all the directories where we can use the Tailwind classes. So for now it's pointing to the app directory, but we're going to use the Tailwind classes into our components folder as well. So let's just copy this and change this to components as well. And let's save this, and then let's see what's the next step. So next we're gonna create a global.css file into our root directory and paste this inside it. So let's create a file global.css and paste the contents. Let's save this, and let's see what's the next step. Next we're gonna add the Babel preset, and here we see the presets and the plugins, and I think we need to add both of them. So let's just copy the presets property and go to our Babel configuration and replace the presets here. And we will need to update the plugins as well. We already have router slash Babel, so let's add the plugin for reanimated. Okay, that's done. Okay, next we're gonna modify our metro.configuration file, and if you won't see this file into your project, just run this command and Expo will create it for you. So let's see what we're gonna change. Let's go to metro.configuration file. Okay, so this is the file, and we need to import with Nativewind component like this, and we need to export the configuration using this. So let's copy this and paste this here, and this should point to the global.css file that you just created. So next we're gonna add a layout component inside our app folder, and we're gonna import the global.css file. So inside app directory, let's create a root layout file, and let's create a functional component. And inside this component, we're gonna copy the slot component and we're gonna export it. A slot component is basically, think of it as it renders your children properties. So because we are using it in a layout component, this is going to render all the children in that layout. So let's just export that, and we are also using our global.css file here, so that's done. Now let's start our project and see if we have successfully implemented Nativewind. Let's wait for it. Okay, we see some warnings. Let's run it on iOS. Let's press I, and it's building, and we got this error. Unable to resolve slot. Maybe we need to create a layout function and then return a slot from it. So let's create a layout function, and here we will just simply return the slot component like this, and let's save this and reload. Okay, so that won't fix our problem. Let's just undo all of this and just use that in here. So inside our view, we'll just render the slot component like this, and let's save this and let's reload. Same error again. Maybe we need to import it like this, and let's reload. Okay, so that error is gone, but now we see another error, and that's because the Expo router doesn't like the version of Reanimated installed into our project. It requires a different version of Reanimated, and when we ran the project, we saw a warning suggesting run this command to fix this issue. So what we're gonna do is copy this command and run this into our project, and this is going to fix the situation. So let's wait a bit. Okay, it's done. Now let's run our project. Now hopefully everything should work fine, and we don't see any warning or error. Let's run it on iOS, and it's building. So the application is running and we don't see any error. That's a good sign. And on the top we see a text coming from our index component. So let's go to our index component, and it says home. We need to add a little padding top so that we can see the text clearly. Let's add a padding top of 40 and save this. Now we can see the home. Now we should be able to use the Tailwind classes for our components. So let's add a class name of background red 200, and let's save this. And it didn't work. Maybe we missed something. Let's go to our layout file. Okay, yeah, we need to import the CSS file. I think we mistakenly removed this when we were fighting with the slot component. So let's import it. So when I save this, you see the background color changes. That means our Tailwind class is working now. So now let's make this text bigger using text3xl class. Now the text is bigger. Now let's also move it to center using text center class, and it's working. So now we no longer need this style property, so let's remove all of this, and we can add a padding top using padding top of let's say 20. So the classes are working now and we have successfully implemented the latest version of Nativewind into our project. So now we're gonna add authentication into our project, and for that we need to go to Expo website, and on the sidebar you will see under the reference the authentication option. Just click on it, and now we're gonna follow this process to implement auth into our project. And we're gonna have a file structure just like this, layout and sign in, and then we're gonna have an app group for our protected routes. So the first thing we're gonna do is add an authentication context, and if I expand this first step, you will find they have implemented a context, and we will save our states and all the functions in this context. They're using the loading and session data. So then we're gonna use local storage to preserve the user token, and then we can use this session provider into our layout file, and we'll be using the loading and session data to check if we want to show the loading or we want to redirect to sign in or home page. So we're going to have a very similar structure just like this. I know all of this sounds a bit confusing, but once we start implementing you will see it's very easy. So the first thing we're gonna do is add our sign in and sign up pages, and we're gonna create these files in our app directory. So let's create sign up as well. And let's create a functional component, and we're gonna change the names to capital sign up. Same goes for the sign in component as well. Okay, so now we're gonna create a folder which will be a group of routes for our protected routes, and I will name it app. If you want to learn more about file-based routes and how groups work in Expo Router, then I have another video on Expo Router. I'll suggest to watch that video before you start this project, so all of your questions will be answered in that video. So now let's create a layout file inside our app group. Let's leave it like that for now. Now let's create another component home, which user will see after he logs in. So let's create a component and rename it. Okay, so currently we have this index page which is shown by default, and we're gonna change this to start page, and we're gonna show a loading state here. So let's rename this to start page. Basically the idea is until we get the user from local storage or from Firebase, we're gonna show a loading state. So that's why we're going to turn this into a loader. Let's add flex1 justify center, and instead of this text we are going to show activity indicator, which is a built-in component. Size would be large and color will be, let's say, gray. Let's save this. We should see the loader. Let's reload the application and see. Okay, so we can see the loader, but it's at the very top. Maybe we need to add item center as well. Why is it not centered? Let's go to layout. Yeah, we need to add a flex1 to this container. So the reason why it was not centered because it didn't have full space. Now we added flex1, so now it is centered. Okay, so next thing we're gonna do is add auth context into our project. So let's create a folder in root directory, and inside this folder let's create auth context file. Okay, so first we're gonna add auth context, and let's create a variable auth context, and we're gonna use the function create context from React, just like this. And then we're gonna create auth context provider, and this will receive all the children components because it's going to wrap our application. And inside this we're gonna use a state for user, which will be null by default, and we're going to use another state is authenticated. Basically we'll use this state to redirect the user to sign in or to home page. So our authentication system will depend on this state, and I'm going to set it to undefined, and I'll explain later why I did that. Now next we're gonna add a use effect hook without any dependencies, so that it acts as a component did mount function. And we're gonna use a function inside this, but not now. We'll be using that function in future. The function will be on auth state change. that is from Firebase. And the idea is basically here we will get the user which will be authenticated, and based on that user we will redirect the user to sign in or homepage. Now let's create some auth functions that we will use later. And login function will receive email and password, and we're going to make it async because we're going to make API calls. Let's add try catch blocks as well, so that if we catch any errors we will show that to user. Let's just copy this for our logout function as well, and we won't receive any parameters, so let's remove them. Let's copy this login function one more time for our register function, and this function will receive email, password, and additionally it will have a username and a profile URL as well. Okay, great. Now we're gonna return our context provider. So let's add context dot provider, and we will render all of our children because this is going to wrap our application. And here we're going to provide a value which will be all the states and all the functions that we're going to receive in those children components. So we have user, authenticated, login, register, and logout. Okay, all done. Now we're gonna create one more hook to use this context provider in any component. So let's create another function, use auth, and this will use a use context hook from React to use this context values, and we need to pass our auth context to this hook. And if we don't get the values, that means this hook was called where the component was not wrapped inside our provider. So we're gonna throw a new error saying use auth must be wrapped inside an authentication context provider. Okay, and if we do get the values, we'll just return the values from here. Okay, this is done for now. We'll come to this component later. So now we need to go to our root layout file, and here I'll just implement a new layout because this layout needs to be wrapped inside our context provider. So let's create a new main layout, and here first we'll use our is authenticated state, and we need to call our use auth function from our context file. So let's import that just like this. Next we're gonna use another hook which is called use segments, and this will return us the segments value. So basically this hook will return us an array of all the segments in current route. So if let's say I'm in index route, and this will give us an array with a string of index, and same goes if we have routes in multiple folders or directories. This is very important because let's say if user is authenticated and he is on sign up page where he shouldn't be, then we can redirect the user on home page. So that's where it is very useful. Now let's create a use effect hook, and this hook will be triggered every time our auth state changes. So this will be dependent on this state, and here we will determine if the user is authenticated or not, and we will do this logic later. But now we need to return the slot component which will render all of our children. So let's return a slot component just like this. Okay, so this is done. Now we need to create another component. So let's change this component to our let's say root layout, because we're gonna use a provider and wrap this main layout with that provider. So let's add auth context provider, and this will import the context provider from our file, and inside this we're going to render our main layout. We are doing this because we need to use the use auth hook inside a provider. That's why we did that. Okay, so our authentication system is totally dependent on this state is authenticated, and this state will be responsible for redirecting the user to home component inside our app group, or to redirect the user in sign in component when it's false. But when it's undefined, we will show the user a loading state, and we have the loading state as a default component. So when it's true, we'll show the home component, and when it's false, we'll show the sign in page. But when it's undefined, we will keep showing the loading state to user. So here we'll make a check. If the type of is authenticated is undefined, we will return. And then we will check if user is in app group or not. We will check the first segment, and if it equals to app group, that will mean user currently is in app group. Now we have two values, in app and is authenticated, and we can use that to see if user is authenticated and user is not in app group. That means we need to redirect the user in home, so we will have a condition for that. We will also check if the user is not authenticated, then we need to redirect to sign in page. But let's add a comment here first. We need to redirect the user to home so that we don't forget it later. So when user is authenticated and is not in home, we need to redirect to home. Otherwise, if user is not authenticated, then we can redirect the user to sign in page. So let's add a comment, redirect to sign in. Now we're gonna use a router to redirect the user wherever we want. So for that, we're going to use router hook from Expo router, and using that we can redirect, but I'm going to use the replace method so that user won't be able to go back to this loading state. Here we will replace it with home component, and if user is not authenticated, then we're going to go to the sign in page. Okay, let's save this. Now you won't see any change because if authenticated state is undefined. So if I go to our context here, so by default you will see we have undefined value for is authenticated state. Now let's say here we have some logic that will get the user after 3 seconds. So for now we'll use a set timeout method. So let's say after 3 seconds we will get the user and we will set is authenticated to true. And if I save this and we wait for 3 seconds, we should be moving to home screen. Okay, so now we are in the layout. It says layout. Why it says layout? So let's go to app group and in home. It should say home. Let's go to layout. Okay, so we need to return a stack component here. That's why it was showing layout. Okay, now we can see our home component. So now let's go back to our auth context. Now if I refresh the app, we will again see a 3 seconds wait, then we will move to home screen. Now let's say user is not authenticated and this will be updated to false. And when I save this, we will again wait for 3 seconds and it will hopefully move to sign in page. Okay, we can't see the sign in text clearly, so let's go to sign in and add some padding top. Let's say padding top of 20. Let's save this. Now we can see sign in page. So if I refresh, we will again see 3 seconds wait and then sign in. Okay, so now we have an authentication system where if the user is authenticated, he will see the home screen. Otherwise, he will see the sign in screen. So later on, when we implement Firebase Auth, we won't have to do a lot because all the basic setup is already done. I'm using this set timeout method so that we can see the loader, but if I make this false and remove this set timeout method, we will immediately see the sign in page. Now we're gonna start designing our sign in page, and before we design this page I need to install some of the libraries first. Starting with the React Native responsive screen, we're gonna use this library to make our app responsive. This library uses the dimensions under the hood, so this will provide us with HP and WP methods, and these are stands for height percentage and the width percentage of the current device. So if I give 80% of WP, that will mean 80% of the current device width, and we can use this for making our font size responsive, and we will have our design something like this. Now let's just copy this install command and open the terminal. Let's open another terminal and paste it here. Okay, that's done. Now we can close the terminal and we can use this library into our project. So let's just copy the import statement into our component. And before we start using this, I need to install another library for our icons, and the library is Expo Vector Icons. And I really like this library because it provides various types of icons, and this is a basic usage of how we can use the icon. And if we click on one of the resources, this will take us to where we can find all the icons, and here I can search all the icons. We have ant design, ionicons, and a lot of other icons. So I'll just open it in another window, and let's just copy this command to install it, paste it here, and it's done. Now let's just refresh the app to see if we have any errors. Okay, great. Now let's start designing and give this container a class of flex1 so that it takes the full space. And inside this, we're gonna use a component to change the colors of our status bar. We're gonna use status bar from Expo, and we're gonna add a style of dark like this. And let's add another container and give this a class of flex1 and a gap of 12. And inside this, we're gonna add a sign-in image at the top. So let's add another view, and to make it centered, let's add a class name of item center. And inside this, let's import the image component from React Native. Now we're gonna use some of the images throughout the development of this app. So let me just copy and paste all the assets into images. Let's just paste them here. And these are some of the images that we'll be using while developing this app. So you can find all of these into this GitHub repo. Now let's just copy the login image that we just copied. We need to go into assets, images, and we need to use the login.png image, and let's save them. None of these files exist. Maybe we misspelled the name. Okay, it needs to be images. We misspelled the images. Okay, we can see the image. Now for the height of this image, I'm going to use HP function from our responsive library, and if I give 25% of HP, that will mean 25% height of overall height of the device. And let's add resize mode to contain. Now we can see the image, but we have this a notch conflicting with our content. So what I'm going to do is add a little padding top to this view, and let's use HP of 8%. Now it looks good. Now let's add a padding horizontal as well. Let's use WP method, and that will mean 5% width of the overall width of the device. We will see this horizontal padding when we add a content at the bottom. So let's add a view and give this a class name of gap 10, and let's add another text view inside this. This will say sign in, and you can see we added a horizontal padding. Now to make this text responsive on all of the devices, we're gonna use responsive font size of HP4. That will make sure it is responsive on all the devices. Let's make our text bold using font bold class and tracking a bit wider using this class, and let's make it centered. Okay, now let's change the color of this. Let's use the text neutral of 800. Okay, this looks good. Now under this text, we're gonna use a form, and we're gonna add all the inputs. So let's add a comment and a view. This will be a wrapper for our email input. So I'm going to give it a height. Let's use HP of 7, and let's add a class name because we're going to use an icon and the input inside this. So I'm going to make it flex row and a little gap of 4, padding horizontal of 4. And for the background color, let's use neutral 100, item center, and to make them rounded, let's use rounded to XL. Okay, now here we're gonna use an icon from our Expo vector icons. So let's go to the documentation, and we already opened the list of all the icons. So here you can search any kind of icon. I'm going to search for mail icon, and you can find a bunch of mail icons that you can use, but I'm looking for the one from Octicons. So let's see where it is. Okay, here. So I'm going to use this icon from Octicons. So let's go to our app, and here if I just type Octicons, this will auto import. And here first we need to provide a name of the icon, which is male, and then the size, which will be HP 2.7, and the color, let's just use gray, and let's save it. Okay, it looks good. Maybe we need to reduce the border radius. Let's use rounded XL. Okay, great. Now after this icon, we need to use a text input. So let's import the text input component. And we need to use the responsive font size. So let's add a style and give this a font size of HP2. And after this, let's add a class name, and let's use flux1 so that it takes the full space in our container. Font semi bold, and the text color should be neutral 700. Now let's save this, and we have the input, but let's add a placeholder will be email address, and let's add a color for this placeholder, which will be gray. And let's save this. Now we can see the placeholder and it looks good. Now we're gonna copy this one more time for our password input field as well. So let's copy this whole view, and we will just change the placeholder from email address to password, and let's save this. um, we need to reduce the space between these two inputs, so let's add another view and give this a class name of gap4, and we will just move these inputs inside this to reduce their spacing. Let's indent them and save them. Okay, now it looks good. So we already have the email icon, but now we need to find the icon for password. Let's go to our Expo vector icons and look for lock icon. I think we can find the lock icon in Octicons. So this is the icon that we're gonna use from Octicons. Let's replace the name to log and save this. Now we have both the icons right. Now after this view, we are gonna add another text at the bottom that will say forgot password. Let's add a view and give this a class name of gap3, and we're going to move this last input inside this so that our last input and forgot password text have a little gap. And inside this we're going to add a text view, and inside this we are going to say forgot password. Okay, we can see the text. Now to make it responsive, let's add a style and give this a font size of HP 1.8, and it should be on the right side. So let's add a class name to make it semi bold, text right, and it's on the right side. Now for the text color, let's add a text neutral of 500, and let's save this. It's not applying. Let's change this to 400. Okay, it is working. So let's change it back to 500. Maybe it was some issue with the cache. So the gap is also not working. We applied the gap of 3 for both of these items. So let's change it to 4, and let's save this. It is working. Let's change to 3. Okay, I think there was something wrong with the cache. Now it's working. Now after this text, we're gonna add a submit button at the bottom. So let's add a button after this view. Let's add a comment submit button, and let's use the touchable opacity, and inside this let's add a text view. Let's give it a responsive font size of 2.7, HP 2.7, and let's add a class name to make our text white, fonts bold, and we need to add the letter spacing. So let's add tracking wider, and let's add sign in text inside this. You won't be able to see it because the text is white, so let's add a background color, and we're gonna use the background of indigo 500, and let's save this. Let's refresh the app. We should be able to see it. Okay, so here we have our button. So let's add some more properties. We need to make it rounded XL, justify center, and item center. Let's save this. Now I need to add a height to this button, so let's add a style and give this a height of HP 6.5. Let's save this, and it looks great. So after this button at the bottom, we need to add a text that will say if user haven't signed up, then we need to provide him a button to go sign up here. So after this touchable opacity, let's add another comment, sign up text, and let's add a view and give this a class name of flex row. We're using flex row because we are going to add two text properties in this view. So let's add a text view, and let's say don't have an account question mark, and after this text view we're going to say sign up. And if I save this, you will see sign up. We need to have a little space, so let's just add a space after this question mark. Okay, great. Now let's add a responsive font size to both of these text views. So let's select both of them and add a style property, add a font size of HP 1.8, and let's add a class name to make them bold. Let's add font semi bold and text neutral 500 for the color of the text. Let's save them. Okay, we need to make our sign up text a bit bolder, and for the color let's use indigo 500 to make it stand out. Okay, great. Now we need to be able to move to the sign up page when we click on this, and for that we need to wrap it in a pressable component. So let's add a pressable, and we need to move this text inside this. And to be able to move to the next screen, we need to use the router. So let's declare our router, and we need to use the use router hook from Expo. Now let's add an onPress method on this pressable, and using our router we need to push the route name, which is sign up. Let's save this. Now if I click on this button, we should go to our sign up page, and it's working. Now let's refresh, and the next thing we're gonna do is store our email and password values somewhere. And I'm not going to use state variable for that, because every time state updates it re-renders the whole page. So I'm going to use the reference to hold the values for email and the password, and currently I'm going to use the empty string for both of the values. And then we're gonna have another function to handle the login process, and this will be triggered every time user clicks on the sign in button, and this is going to be an async method. Now when the value changes inside this input, we're going to update the current value of the email reference. So let's change email ref dot current value to the value given by this component, and let's copy this for the password as well. Using this method won't re-render every time user presses a key, so that is very useful. Now let's add our handle login function on this touchable opacity. Now every time user presses on this button, we need to check if we don't have any values inside the references. We need to show a message. So let's check if we don't have any value in the email reference, or we don't have any value in the password reference. Then we're going to use alert from React Native, and we're gonna show the user with a title and a message. Title will be sign in, and the message is going to be please fill all the fields. Okay, now we need to return from here, and after this if we have both of these values, then we will begin the login process. So let's just add a comment login process. Let's save this. Now if I click on this button, we will see this error because I haven't added any value, and if I leave one field blank, we will still get this error. And let's add both. Okay, we need to change this to secure text entry. So let's add a property secure text entry that will hide our password. Okay, great. Now when we are signing in the user, we need to show a loading state instead of this sign in button. And for that, we're going to use Lottie Animations to show a loading animation. So let's go to our browser and we need to install this package, Lottie React Native. And if I scroll down, you will see a very basic usage of how we can use a Lottie animations into our app. So let's copy this command and install this first into our project. Let's paste it here. And for the animation, I usually go to a website lottiefiles.com. You can use any other resource where you can get these Lottie animations, but I'm going to use this one. So if I scroll down here, you will see a comparison about how Lottie animation is better than GIF animations. So I recommend using Lottie animations, and let's discover some animations. I'm just going to show you how you can download the animation from this website. So just search for loading animation. Here you can find a bunch of animations. Just click on the one that you like. So for example, let's use this one. So if I click on this, first I need to save it into my workspace to be able to download it. So let's just save it, and this will open this animation in an editor, and at the top you will see the download icon. So you can download the Lottie JSON file from here. I've already downloaded a loading state animation from this website, and I've copied that animation into my assets. So now we need to use this library into our project, and this is the basic usage of this library. So first we need to create a component for our loading states. So let's create a loading file and create a functional component. Now the size of this loading state will be provided from the parent component. So we're going to set the height as the size which will be passed to this component. So let's use that, and let's give this an aspect ratio of 1. Now here I'm going to display the Lottie view, and we need to import the Lottie view first. So let's just copy this import statement, and let's add our Lottie view and give this a style of flex1. And for the source, I've already added a Lottie animation file into our assets. So let's require that into our assets, images, and the file name is loading.json. And we need to add some properties like autoplay and loop. This will make sure this animation plays in infinite loop. Now we can use this animation into our sign in component. So let's go to sign in, and we're gonna use that here. And for that we need to have a state for loading. So let's add loading, set loading, and by default it's going to be false. And let's go to our sign in button, and first let's add a view, and inside this view we're going to check if loading is true. Then we're gonna show a loading, otherwise we're going to show this touchable opacity. So let's just copy this and move this to else part, and let's indent it. Now here let's add a view and give this a class name of flex row and justify center so that our loading state should display in center. Let's close this, and here we need to import our loading component that we just created, and we need to pass the size. So let's use HP8 for the size of our loading animation, and let's save this. Now to be able to see it, we need to toggle our loading state. So we need to make it true, and let's save this. Okay, we can see our loading animation. Maybe let's just reduce the size to 6.5. Okay, that's better. So we can display our Lottie animation. So let's make it false, and this will be displayed while signing in when we create this login process. So our sign-in component is complete. Now we're gonna work on our keyboard avoiding view, but because we don't have a lot of inputs on this screen, so we will do it in our sign up screen. Now we need to copy all of this code because the sign up screen will be very similar. So let's copy this into sign up screen, and we'll just make a few changes starting with the name of this component, sign up. Then this function will be handle register. So let's change this, and let's reduce the padding top to 7. We also gonna use a different image for our sign up screen. So I've already stored it. It's called register.png. So if I save it and go to our sign up page, we get an error. That's because we changed the function name to handle register and we use handle login. That's why we're getting this error. Okay, so still a lot to change. We need to change this text to sign up. So let's find this. Okay, here we need to change this to sign up. Let's save this. And we also don't need this forgot password as well. So we need to remove this container and remove this text as well. And let's indent them. Now let's change that button text to sign up. And here at the bottom we see this don't have an account. We need to change this as well. This should say already have an account. Have an account, then press here to sign in, not sign up. And because we changed the text, it needs to go to sign in page, not sign up. So let's change the route name to sign in. Let's save this. Now if I press on this button, this should go to sign in, and if I press on sign up, it should move to sign up. Now here we need to add some more input fields, but before that we need to reduce the size of this image. Let's use HP20. Okay, now for our next inputs, let's define our references. So we're gonna use a username reference and a profile reference for the profile URL, and let's add them into our condition so that if user does not add that, we should alert the user to fill in all the fields. And we need to change the alert message to sign up, and this will say please fill all the fields, and this will begin the register process. Okay, great. Now let's add the inputs for this username and profile URL. Let's just copy the email for 2 times and let's save this. Now at the top we're going to have a username input, so let's just change the placeholder to username, and we need to change the email reference to username reference, and this profile URL should be at the very last. So let's just copy this and place it after the password field, and we need to change this to profile URL, and let's save this. Okay, now we have all the feeds and we need to change the icons, but let's change the reference for the profile as well. Okay, now we need to find the icons for these new inputs. So let's go to our Expo icons, and first we need to find the icon for username. So let's use the icon from Feather. This is the user icon from Feather. So let's go to our username field, and here instead of octagons we need to import feather icons, and the name will be user. Let's save this, and now we have a user icon for the username. Now for the profile URL we're going to add an image icon. So let's search for image, and we have an image icon in the feather icons, so let's use that. Let's change the library to feather and the name will be image. Let's save it. Now we have all the icons and all the inputs are looking great. Now next we're gonna test if our error message shows if we don't have any data into any field. So let's press it and we see this error. Let's add some data and see if our validation works. At gmail.com, let's add a password and just random profile URL. Okay, it needs to be a text. Why is it like a password? We haven't added secure text entry on the image. Maybe we need to just refresh it. So let's just reload the app and go to sign up and test this image URL. Okay, it works. So I think it was a cache issue. So let's add data again. Say at gmail.com, some random password and a test profile. It shouldn't display this alert because we have all the data. Maybe we made a mistake. Profile ref, password, email, username, everything looks alright. Email, password, username. Okay, I think we misspelled this. This should be current. Okay, let's save this. Now if I press on this button, nothing happens, and this means our validations are correct and it's working. Now the next issue that we're gonna fix is our keyboard avoiding view. You see, when I click on a field and open the keyboard, this covers the input and we are not able to type any data into our image field. So let's create a custom component to fix this situation. Let's go to our components, and here I'm going to create a file, custom keyboard view, and let's create a functional component inside this. We are going to remove all of this code and we're going to use a component from React Native, which is keyboard avoiding view. And inside this, we're going to add a scroll view so that all of our content should be in a scrollable view. Let's create this, and here we need to render the children's because we're going to wrap our sign in and sign up pages with this custom keyboard view, and they will be displayed under this scroll view. Now let's add a behavior property on this keyboard avoiding view, and this is different for iOS and Android devices, but we can check if we are currently on iOS or not using the platform.os property. This will give us an iOS string if we are on iOS device. Now using this, if we are on iOS, the behavior will be padding, and if we are on Android devices, this will be height. Okay, now let's add a style for this keyboard avoiding view as flex1. Now let's add some properties to our scroll view. Let's give this a style of flex1, and we're gonna make the bounces to false so that when you scroll the counted and it bounces on the edges, that shouldn't happen. And we need to hide the vertical scroll indicator as well. Now you can also wrap this in a touchable opacity and dismiss the keyboard when you click on it, but I found out that it already does that, so I don't need to do that. Now let's go to our sign up page and start using this component. First let's reload the application. Okay, we need to go to our sign up page, and here instead of this wrapper, let's import our custom keyboard view, and let's copy this close tag and replace it here. Let's save this, and now it shouldn't make any change on the sign up screen, but our keyboard issue should be fixed. So let's just refresh, go to sign up. Now if I click on this, nothing will happen, but our content is scrollable and we can add data for profile URL. Or if I directly click on profile URL, this will push the inputs so that we can add data for profile URL. So this way, if you have a lot of inputs on the screen, you can use this technique to fix the keyboard avoiding view. There might be other solutions to this problem, but I found this easy and it works great on iOS and Android devices as well. So now we need to implement this on our sign in screen as well. So let's go to sign in component, and instead of this view, we're gonna import custom keyboard view, and let's copy this for our closing tag. Let's save this. Okay, so we don't have the keyboard issue on this screen because we only have two fields, but if we were on a smaller screen, then maybe we would have faced this issue. So that's why I added the custom keyboard view. So now we're gonna add Firebase Authentication, and for that we need to go to Firebase console. So let's go to our browser and we're gonna open console.firebase.google.com, and we need to create a new app. So let's create a new project and we're gonna name our project Firebase Chat. Let's continue. No, we don't need Google Analytics. Let's create project. Okay, our project is created. Let's hit continue. And the first thing we're gonna do is add a web app. So at the top you will see these three icons. Just click on the web icon and let's name our web app Firebase Chat Web App. Let's register, and we need to install Firebase into our project. Then we're gonna add this configuration for Firebase. So let's copy this command to install Firebase. Let's open our terminal and paste it here. Okay, so now we're gonna copy all of this code to our app. So let's create a Firebase configuration file into our root directory and paste all of this code here. So basically this is initializing our app from Firebase that we can use to connect to our project and use authentication and database. So I'm gonna create a variable for our authentication service. So we're gonna use a function initialize auth. Maybe we need to import it manually. So sometimes it doesn't work, you have to import manually. Let's import something from Firebase/auth. Now we're gonna import another function from auth. It's called get react native persistence. This will be basically used to persist the user from Firebase, and we're gonna import initialize auth as well. So let's use initialize auth and we're gonna pause our application. Then we're gonna add some options for persistence and we're gonna use get react native persistence. Now in this function we're gonna add our async storage library. So let's go to our browser and let's search for that library, react native async storage. So this is the library that we're gonna use. So let's just copy this command to quickly install it. Okay, it's installed. Now let's import this library, async storage, from react native. What's this called? Yeah, this one. So let's use this library into our get react native persistence. So this will be responsible for persisting the user into local storage. Even if you refresh the app, we don't lose the user data. Now let's create another variable for our database, and we're gonna use a function get firestore, and we need to import it manually because I'm not sure why auto import is not working. So we need to import from Firebase/firestore, and we're gonna import get firestore, and let's also import the collection function for reference of our collection. So let's use get firestore and we're gonna pause our application. Now let's create another variable for the reference of our user collection. So let's call it usersref, and we're gonna use the collection function. We're gonna pause database and the collection name will be users. So let's copy this one more time for our rooms collection. Let's call it room ref. I've just added these because later I'm gonna add or fetch data from these collections. So I just added the reference for these two collections. So I think this will be all for this file. We won't be editing this file again. So let's go to Firebase and continue to console. And here we're gonna enable our authentication. So let's click on authentication and hit get started. Here you will see a bunch of providers, but we're gonna use a simple one, just email and password provider. So let's enable it and save it. Now we also gonna enable our Firestore to use the database. So let's go to Cloud Firestore and hit get started. So here you will need to choose the location of your cloud server. You can choose this according to whichever the closest region you have. So I'm gonna choose Singapore and hit next. We will be using for test mode and enable. Okay, so it's setting up. Okay, so we don't see any data because we haven't created any. So now let's go to our app and implement authentication, and for that we need to go to our context. So if you remember previously, this is the use effect hook where we're gonna decide if the user is authenticated and not. So we're gonna use a hook from Firebase and it's gonna return us a callback to unsubscribe it. And the hook is called on auth state changed. I think we need to import it manually. So let's import from Firebase/auth on auth state change. Now let's use it here. So the first parameter will be the authentication variable that we created in our Firebase configuration file, and second will be a callback with user value. So the way it works is when the user is authenticated, we will get the user values. Otherwise, user value will be null and we can set the authentication state to false. So if we have the user value, we're going to set authenticated as true. Otherwise, we're going to set it as false. Now based on this, we're going to redirect the user to login or sign in. So we also need to set the user values because we have the user state as well. So if we have the user value, we're going to set the user. Otherwise, we're going to set the user as null. And lastly, we're going to return this unsub callback so that when component unmounts, this will clear this hook. Now to test this, we're gonna implement sign up functionality. So let's go to our register function, and here we're gonna use a function to create user, and this will give us a response. So let's use await keyword, and the function we're gonna use is create user with email and password, but it's not importing, so let's import it manually. Let's import create user with email and password. Let's also import sign in with email and password as well because we're gonna use it later. So now let's use this function, and we're gonna pass our authentication service that we created in our Firebase configuration file, and we're gonna use email and password which will be passed to this function. And if we get the response, we're gonna console log to see if we get the user on response. So let's just console log response dot user. If we get the user, that will mean user is authenticated, and we can update the auth state here and we can set the user. But I won't recommend it because we are already doing it in auth state changed hook. So if we sign up and this hook will be triggered automatically, we will get the user and we will update the state and the user here. So we don't really need to do this. So this create user with email and password function creates a user in authentication system, but it does not store your username or profile URL. So what we need to do is create another collection to store our username and profile, and we will use the user UID as well. So let's create a document. And to create a document, we're gonna use add doc method from Firebase. So let's import add doc. Maybe we need to import it manually. Let's just import all of the functions that we're gonna use in this file from Firebase Firestore, and we're gonna use add doc. Actually, we don't really need it, so let's use doc method for a document reference and get doc to get a document and then set doc. Okay, we're not using add doc method because it generates the ID automatically, but we're gonna set it manually. That's why we are using set doc. Set document basically creates or updates the existing document, but most importantly, it lets us use the manual document ID. So that is very useful. Now for the document reference, let's use doc method, and inside we're gonna pass the DB reference, and second will be our collection name, which will be users, and the third parameter will be the document ID, which we will get from our response.user. So every user have this UID, which is a unique ID for each user. We will use that for each document in the users collection, and after this reference we're gonna pass the data for this user. So okay, we forgot this dot. Okay, all good. If you want to learn more about how I'm using all these Firebase functions, you can visit their documentation. I'll leave the link below in the video description. So this is how you use a set document method, and you can provide your own ID compared to add document. So if we go to the documentation for add document, you will see we don't have to provide the ID. So it automatically creates the ID and adds the data. That's why we're using set document. I'll leave this link into the video description so you can check out. Now we're gonna add our data for our username and the profile URL. So let's add that, and let's also add the user ID, which will be response.user.uid. Now after this we're gonna return a response. So let's return an object that will say success true, and data will be the user that we just created, response.user. And if we get any error, we will return a response as well, but success will be false. And we're gonna include a message that will be error.message, and let's save this. Okay, now this is all done. Now we're gonna go to sign up page and we're gonna implement this function. So here we have this handle register function. First we're gonna start the loading as we are signing up, and then we're gonna use the register function. So this will give us a response. Let's await for register function, and for that we need to use our context. So let's get our register function from our use auth hook, and we're gonna use this register function here, and inside we're gonna pass the email.current value, and then we're gonna pass the password value. Then we're gonna pass the username and the profile URL as well. So let's add all the values here, and once this is executed we will get the response. Now we need to set the loading to false, and let's remove this command. And if we get any response, we will console log to see the result. So let's console log this, and if we get the success as false on this response, that will mean we got an error. So we will have a condition for this, and we will check if the success value is false. We will just alert the user with an error. So we'll use alert, title will be sign up, and the message will be the message from response. Okay, let's save this, and now we can test this functionality. So let's test with invalid data. I will use an invalid email. So let's use a password, and for the profile URL, let's use test for now. And if I hit sign up, we see a loading and we get an error, invalid email. But this is not user friendly because it says auth/invalid email, as you can see in the console, and we can't show this to user, so we're gonna change it. So let's go to our auth context, and here we're gonna store this error.message into a message variable, and we're gonna check if the message includes this token. We will check for auth/invalid email. So let's just copy this one, and if message includes this one, then we're gonna change the message to say only invalid email so that it's more user friendly. And now we can send this message instead of this error.message like this, and let's save this. Now let's test this one more time, and we will again use an invalid email just to see if we are getting our error message. Hit sign up, and we got our error message. Okay, great. Now let's try with the real data at gmail.com. Let's add our password, and for the profile URL, let me just copy my channel profile. Let's go to images and let's use this one. Let's open it in another window. Okay, so let's use this URL as our profile URL. Let's paste it here and hit sign up, and we got an error, db does not exist. Okay, I think we forgot to import this db variable from our Firebase configuration. So let's import it. But we did sign up. As you can see, we moved to our home page, and that's only possible if the authenticated state change. So we got the user in here and we set the authenticated state as true and we set the user. But because of this DB error, we were unable to create this user document in user collection. So if we move to Firebase, and let's go to authentication, and here you can see a user that is authenticated, but it won't be there in user collection because of the DB error. But now I've fixed this, so we won't see this again. So now let's delete this user and we will try this one more time. Let's delete it. Now before we try this again, on the home screen we're gonna add a button to log out the user. So let's go to our home component here, and let's use the logout method from our use auth hook like this, and we're gonna create a button just to test if our logout is working. Title will be signed out. So let's save this, and text strings must be rendered within a text components, but we're not doing it, so this may be a cache issue. So let's refresh. Okay, so now we're gonna create a function handle logout, which will be called when we press on this button, and we're gonna call this logout method inside this, and we need to make this function async so that we can use the await keyword. Let's add an onPress method on this button, and we will use handle logout method. This will take care of the logout functionality for now. So let's move to sign up and try this one more time. me@gmail.com. Let's add my password, and I've already copied the image, so let's paste the URL and hit sign up. Okay, so we didn't see any Firebase error, but this error again. Text strings must be rendered within a text, but we are not doing it. Not sure why this is happening. Maybe we need to comment this button. Okay, it's gone. So we see our home screen. That means our sign up functionality working. So let's add a pressable instead of this button, and we will use a text component inside this that will say sign out, and we will add a on press method on this pressable, and we will use our handle logout method here. Okay, so our sign up was successful and we can see the logs in the console. So we got the user, and even if I refresh the app now, we will see the home screen again, because Firebase is handling all the session data and is storing the user data into the local storage. Basically, every time we refresh the app, our on auth state changed method triggers and we get the user that is authenticated. So if I console log this and save this, we will see we got the user, and that is the user we currently signed up with. And here we have the UID at the bottom, you can see, and we use this ID to create the user document in the users collection. So now we can refresh the app and we will see the home screen because the user is authenticated. And even if I remove the apps from recent apps and open the iOS app again, it will still go to home screen, and that's because we used a local storage that Firebase uses to persist the user. So if I go to Firebase configuration, you can see here we use async storage and Firebase uses it to persist the user session. So when we refresh the app or open the app, this on auth state change triggers and we get the user, and then we set the authenticated state. But after this authentication, we also created a document inside users collection. So let's go to Firebase and go to Firestore database. Okay, so you can see we got a users collection, and inside this we got a document with a document ID which will be same as the user UID from our authenticated user. This will be the same as this ID. So inside this we got the profile URL, username, and the user ID. Now let's go back and implement our sign out functionality. Let's move to logout function, and here we need to use a function from Firebase which is sign out. We need to import it manually, so let's import it from Firebase/auth. Now let's minimize this terminal. Okay, so let's use this sign out method here. And if we are signed out, we're gonna return a response with success as true. But if we get any error while signing out, we will return success as false and we will return an error message. So currently we are getting the user when the user is authenticated, but when we press the sign out, we will get the user as null and we will hopefully move to sign in page. So if I open the console, you can see we got the user and here we will get the user as null. So let's press on this button and it doesn't work. So let's move to our home screen and we have applied this method. So maybe we need to refresh the app. Let's try this one more time. Nothing happens and we don't see any logs. Maybe we made a mistake somewhere. Let's go to auth context. Okay, so we need to add our auth service here that we created in our Firebase config. So now when I press on this button, we move to sign in and as you can see in the console we got the user as null, and this is happening because when we signed out this hook triggered and we got the user as null, and because it's null we will set the authenticated state as false. And if I go to root layout, you can see if the authenticated state is false, the router will redirect us to the sign in page. Okay, so let's go to sign up. And now I'm gonna try to register the same email that we registered before just to see if the validation from Firebase is working. So let's add password, some test URL, and we got this error. Auth email is already in use, but we're not gonna show this error. So let's copy this and we will change this message. Let's go to register and let's copy this one, and if the message contains this, that means we need to change it, and let's change this to this email is already in use. Okay, let's save this. Now let's try this one more time with the same email. This time we won't get this ugly error. So let's sign up and it's working. Okay, so now we need to work on our sign in functionality. So let's go to our login function. And here we need to call a function that will give us a response, and we already have imported this function sign in with email and password. We need to add our authentication servers, email and password. Then we're gonna return a response as success true, and if we get any error then we will just copy the error messages from our register function because we're going to use the same structure here. And I'm going to remove email already in use because this time we are signing in, so we won't get this error. Now let's go to our sign in page and implement this login function. So here we need to start the loading first, so let's set the loading as true, and then we're gonna get a response from our login function, await login, and we need to get this login function from our context. So let's use our use auth hook, and inside this login function we're gonna provide our email value and the password value. So we are using reference, so let's use reference current value and password reference current value. Okay, so let's set the loading to false, and here we're gonna check if the success value from response is false, then we're gonna show this error to user. So we're going to use alert from React Native, and the title will be sign in and message will be the message property from our response object. Okay, so let's save this, and I'm going to try this with wrong credentials just so that we can add our validations, and let's see what type of error we get. So we got auth invalid credentials, but we're not gonna show this to user, so we didn't console log this and that's why we can't see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a console log here to show this response, and I'm going to try this one more time. sign in, and we console log this. Now I'm going to copy this, and we need to change this message into our login function. So let's just copy this, and if the message includes this, then we're going to change this to wrong credentials. Okay, let's save this and try this one last time just to see if we got everything right. Then hit sign up. Okay, so everything looks fine. Let's go to sign in, and before we try with real data, everything looks right. Let's just remove this comment. Okay, now let's try with the user that we registered before, homie@gmail.com, and let's use my password and hit sign in. Okay, so we're moving to home screen. That means our login functionality is also working and our validations are also correct. So let's go to auth context, and here you will notice in the console we got the user, and when we logged in, this auth state change hook triggered and we got the user, and then we set it into the user state that we can use anywhere. But this is not the complete user data, and I will show you in a second. If I go to home component, and here I can use this user data. So let's get this user from use auth, and let me console log this user data. So if I save this, you will see the user data in the console, but this data is coming from authentication service, and it does not include the username and the profile URL that we stored into the user collection. So if we move to Firebase, we will see we also need the username and user profile data to show into our application. So for that, what we will need to do is go to our auth context, and here when we get the user, we need to update the user data. So what we will do is we will pass the user UID, and we will fetch the user data based on this ID, and then we will update the username and the profile data. So let's create this function update user data. This will be an async function, and we will receive the user ID, and based on this ID we can fetch the user data, because if you remember previously we stored the user with the UID, so that's why it is very important. Now let's use the doc method from Firebase to get the reference of this document. Let's use DB and the users collection and the user ID. Now based on this reference we can get the document data. So we will get a document snapshot from using a function getDoc. Make sure you import getDoc from Firebase, not getDocuments. So this will return us a document snapshot, and we need to pass the document reference. And here we can check if the document exists on this snapshot. So we will use exist function to check if the document exists. Make sure this is a function, and if this exists, then we can get the data from this snapshot using the docsnap.data function. Now using this data we can update the user value. So let's use the set user method, and we're gonna provide the user values, but this can be null if we refresh the app, but let's add it anyways. Now let's add other values like username, and we're gonna need a profile URL from the user data, and the user ID, because our auth user can be null, so we're gonna use this user ID, and this needs to be colon. Okay, so let's save this, and we should be getting this updated data after some time. So at the bottom you can see we got the username as Nomi, and we also must be getting the profile URL somewhere, and this object has a lot of properties, so it's really hard to find any property. Let's just search for the profile URL, and this will be highlighted, profile URL. Okay, so we got the profile URL here, and this is the image, and we got the username as well that we can use into our application. So we need to comment some of these console logs because our terminal looks a total mess. So we still are getting user data, and that is coming from our home component. Let's comment this out. Let's refresh the app, and this time we won't see anything. So let's uncomment this console log. So we can see the user data, but this data was auth user data that we saw previously, but as we called the update user data, and at that point the user was null, so we only seeing the collection data and the user ID. So I'm sure this is not confusing. So now we have the user data, and oh, I just noticed we imported the button from React Native web, and that's why it wasn't working. It was very annoying, so let's just remove this. Now let's log out and try to register some more users. Let's go to sign up, and here let's use John Snow, john@gmail.com, and let's use a password. And for the profile, let's use this image. So let's copy the URL and paste it here and hit sign up, and hopefully we don't see any error this time. Okay, so we are signing in and we are moving to home screen. Now let's see if we can see this user in the Firebase console. So you can see we have this second document, and if we click on this we get the user ID, Jon Snow, profile URL. So this is all working. Now let's create one more account. So let's go to sign up. Let's use tom@gmail.com, and this is from our cartoon characters Tom and Jerry. So let's use an image. Let's close this one, and we're going to use this image. Let's copy the URL and paste it here and hit sign up, and we are moving to home screen. So our sign up is working. Now let's sign out. Sign out is working, and let's test our sign in one last time. Let's put our password, hit sign in. Okay, so all the functionalities are working, and with this we have successfully implemented authentication from Firebase into our application. So now we're gonna design our home section, and we're gonna add a custom header for our home screen. So before that we need to set a background color of white for our home screen. So let's add a class of flex1 and background of white. It's not applying. Let's refresh. Okay, so we can see the background white. Now we're gonna go to our app layout, and we are gonna change the header for this screen. So we need to add this screen to this tag. Let's use tag.screen, and let's add the name property, which will be home, and we're gonna use some options where we can use the header component. So in this function we need to add our custom header. So let's move to components and create home header. Let's create a functional component. Let's save this and use it here. Now this is going to replace the header that is provided by the Expo router. So let's save this, and we have a warning: no route named home exists. um, it's because we used the home with capital H, so it needs to be small h. Okay, so we can see the home header at the top. Now let's go to our header and start designing. We also gonna need our responsive library, so let's copy it from sign in screen to here. Now let's give this container a padding top so that the content inside won't conflict with the notch area. Here we can add a different padding for iOS and Android devices, and we will need to make a check if the device is iOS or not using the platform.os property. Now we can use this iOS variable to provide different padding for both the platforms. And for the padding, we're going to use the top property from safe area insets. So let's get the top property from a hook called use safe area insets. And for iOS we'll use the top property, but for Android we need to increase it by 10 pixels. Now let's save this, and our content is saved from the notch area. So inside this component we're gonna add a text component and our user profile. So let's make it flex row and justify between. Let's also add a little horizontal padding. So let's add px of 5, and let's add a background of indigo 400, padding bottom of 6, and we need to make the bottom rounded. So let's use rounded bottom of 3xl, and let's save it. Now we can see our header, but let's add a shadow. So let's use shadow class, Okay, it looks good. Now inside this header component, we're gonna add a text view. So let's add a wrapper around it, and let's add our text component that will say chats, because we're gonna show a list of all the chats here. Now let's make it responsive using the font size of HP3, and let's also add the class names to make it bold. Let's use font medium, and text should be white. Okay, so it looks good. Now after this view, we're gonna add the profile image. So let's add a view. Now we can use the image component from React Native, but it does not use cache. So we're gonna need something that uses cache, so our images won't have to load again and again. So what we're gonna use is Expo image. So this will only load the image once, and then it will show the loaded image. So that is very helpful. Now let's install this using this command. Let's open the terminal and paste the command here. Okay, so it's installing. Now we need to import it. So let's copy this and let's remove this and paste it here. It uses a blur hash that is also a blurred image, but as a placeholder. So this will be shown until the real image loads. So we can use this as well. So let's copy this image code and paste it here. Let's indent it. Okay, now let's give this a style with a height of HP 4.3. Let's use aspect ratio of 1, border radius of 100 to make it rounded. Okay, so now we can remove these two properties. We don't need it. Actually, we do need the transition, so let's keep it. And transition is the time until the placeholder image shows. So let's make it 500. And for the blur hash, we are gonna store it somewhere. So let's create a folder, utils, and inside this let's create a file, common.js, and here we will keep our blur hash. So let's copy this line and paste it here. Okay, so let's do that and export it from here. Okay, now we can use the blur hash and we can save it. So now we can see our profile image, and this blur hash will show for 500 milliseconds, and then we'll show the real image. Now for the image, we're going to use the currently logged in user image, and that we can get from the user property as profile URL. Now we need to use the user from our use auth hook because we already stored it into our context. So let's use auth and let's save it. Okay, so we can see the profile image of the currently logged in user. So if I log out and log in with a different account, it will show the profile image accordingly. So let's log in with Jon Snow's account. Let's hit sign in. It's going to load the image for the first time, but after that it won't have to load the image. So now we're gonna add a context menu on top of this image, and for that we're going to use a component React Native pop-up menu, and here is how it looks. It doesn't look good, but we can work on the design. So let's copy this line and install this component into our app. Let's paste it here, and it's done. Now let's see how we can use this. So let's go to the documentation, and we're gonna use this menu provider. So let's copy this, and we're gonna wrap our entire app with this. So let's go to root layout and copy this here. We are doing this because the menu shows on top of all the components, so we need to wrap this around our app. Let's indent it and save it. Now let's see the menu component. Okay, so we have wrapped around the app. Now there are a lot of components, so menu, trigger, and options. Let's just copy all of them, and because we're going to use it in our home header, let's paste them here and let's indent them. We need to indent it like this, and we need to import all the components as well. So let's copy this statement and paste it here. Now let's save this and see how it looks like. Okay, so we got an option, select action on top of the profile picture. Let's select it. Okay, so we got it working, but we want to make our profile image as a trigger for this menu. So for now, let's just comment these menu options and let's add a closing tag for this menu trigger. Let's remove this text, and inside this we will move our profile image like this, indent this. Okay, so let's save this. Now we won't see the text, but let's uncomment this to see if it's working. And if I click on this, okay, so our profile image is the trigger for this menu now. So if you want to add styles to this menu trigger, you can do that as well. You just need a property, custom styles, and inside this we can add another property. I believe it's called trigger wrapper, and this is an object for all the styles for this wrapper. So let's add a comment trigger wrapper style. I'm going to leave it as it is, but if you want to style it differently, you can do that as well. Now inside the components folder, we're gonna add another component for custom menu items. So we're going to remove the menu options and we will be creating our own. So let's create a new file, custom menu items. And inside this, we're gonna export a component. So let's call it menu item. And this is going to receive the text property and action and the value for this action and an icon for this menu item. So now we're gonna return the menu option component. So it's not going to auto import. So let's go to our header, and this is the component. So let's copy the import statement. Let's copy this entire code and paste it here. Now let's move all of this. We only need the menu option. Let's move these as well. And let's use the menu option here. Now we're gonna use our responsive library here. So let's move to our parent component and copy this responsive library here. Okay, so now when user presses on this menu option, we need to add a property on select. And here we can call the action and the value passed to this component like this. Okay, so inside this we will add a view, and that will be the view for our menu item. So let's give it a padding horizontal of 4 and padding vertical of 1. Let's make it flex row because we're going to add the text and the icon side by side. Justify between and item center. Now here we're gonna use the text and the icon, but let's use the text component for both of them just for testing to see if everything works. Let's save this. Okay, so now we can use this. So let's go to our parent component, and we need to remove these menu options so that we can use our custom menu item. Now let's import it from custom menu items, and let's close it and save it and see how it looks. So if I click on this, we get this error. Okay, so we need to import the view. Let's also import the text component from React Native as well. Now let's save this and test this again. Okay, so we can see our custom menu item. Now here we're going to have two menu items, one for the profile and other for the logout button. So let's go to home header and add these icons and the text properties. So for the first one, we're going to have a text property as profile, and we're going to have an action which will be a function handle profile. And for the value, let's just use null for now. And for the icon, we're going to use the user icon from feather icons. We already used this icon into our sign up screen. So let's use feather icons. The name will be user, and for the size, let's use HP 2.5, and let's add the neutral color for this icon, and let's close it and save it. Okay, so this function doesn't exist, so let's create this function. Handle profile, let's leave this empty for now, and let's save it. So the error is gone. Now if we move to menu item, we can use this text and the icon property. So let's remove this. Actually, we're gonna use the text first. So let's remove this and add a text property. And let's add a responsive font size of HP 1.7. And let's add a class name to make it bold. Let's use the class font semi bold. And for the text color, let's use neutral 600. And inside this we can use our text property, and after this we can use our icon. So let's save this. And now if we click on this, we can see our text property and the icon coming from our home header. So now we can copy this for our sign out menu item as well. And let's change the text to sign out. And let's change this function to handle logout. And let's create this function. We need to make this async because we're going to call an async function inside this. And let's await for the logout function. And we can use this logout function from our use auth hook. It needs to be log out. So let's get this function from our use auth hook. And let's save this. This is going to log us out from the application. Now we will need a different icon for this sign out button. We can't use the user icon. Let's go to Expo vector icons and find the logout icon. Okay, we can use this logout icon from design. So let's import the design icons and we will change the name to logout. Okay, so let's save this, and if I click on the menu now, we will see two items, but now we will need a divider between them. So let's create another function. Let's call it divider, and this is going to return a view which will be a very thin line between these two items. So let's return a view and give this a class name of padding. Let's use padding of 1 pixel, and you can use the custom paddings like this. Width will be full and background of neutral 200. And let's save this. Now we can use this divider between these two items, and let's save this. And now we can see the divider between these two items. Now we're gonna work on the design of these menu options. So let's add a property custom styles in menu options, and inside this we can add another property option container, and here we can add all the styles. So let's add border radius of 10, border curve as continuous, and to place it anywhere around the component we can add margin top, margin left. So you can use these values according to wherever you want to place it. So I'm going to use margin top as 40 and margin left as -30, and let's use the background as white, and let's save this. Okay, it looks good and the placement is right. So this way you can add styles to your menu options. So now we're going to reduce the shadow under this menu option. So let's use the shadow opacity as 0.2, and let's add shadow offset, and we will use height and width as 0. Now I also want to make it a bit smaller. So for that we can use the width property. So let's use width as 160 and save it. Okay, it looks good now and we have reduced the shadow as well. Now let's see if the sign out works. Okay, it's working, and that's because we implemented a logout function inside this that's coming from our context. So let's sign it with my other account, nomi@gmail.com. Let's use my password and sign in. Okay, everything's working. We need to change the P in the profile, that needs to be capital. So let's change this to capital P and let's save it. So this way you can add these pop-up menus inside your app, and you can design and place them wherever you want in your application. So now we're gonna add a user list on the home screen. So for that, let's go to our home component, and we're gonna have a user list here. So let's remove this and let's create a state for storing all the user. And for now, I'll just use dummy data. So it will be an array with this dummy data. So we don't really need this, and we're gonna use a component status bar here to make all the fonts in our status bar white like this. And here we're gonna check if we have any users, then we will show a user list. Otherwise, we are going to have a container here that will show a loading. Let's give it a class name of flex and item center. And to add a padding top, we will just add a top value. And for that, we'll use our height percentage function. So let's copy it from our sign in screen to this component. And we'll use HP of 30. To get rid of these red lines, we're gonna need to add something if we have the users. So here we will have a chat list component. So let's add chat list. We're gonna pass the users to this component. And for the loading, we will just use a built-in component activity indicator. So let's import that. We will have a large loading component. So let's add size as large. Okay. We will need to create this component. So let's go to our components folder and create a new component, chat list. Create a function, and this will receive the users that we're going to pass from home component. Let's save this and import it here. Okay, now let's save this and see. Okay, we can see the chat list, but to be able to see this loading, we need to remove this dummy data. Okay, why is this small? Okay, so we misspelled this, it should be large. So this is how the loading will show, but you can use the loading component that we created before using Lottie Animations. So let me import that, and let's give this a size of HP 10. And if I save this, we can see the loader, but you can use either one, but I'm going to use the activity indicator here. So I'll just use this, and let's add the values so that we can see our chat list component. Okay, now we already moved the logged functionality to header, so let's remove this, and here we're going to have a function get users. This will be an async function, and here we'll fetch the users from Firebase. So let's just add a comment for now, and we're going to call this inside use effect hook when this component mounts. So let's call this function here. We're also gonna make a check here to see if we have an authenticated user and we have the user UID. Only then we're gonna make this call. So let's add this condition, and we will call this get users function. For now, we will just implement the chat list with dummy data, but later we will implement this get users function. So now let's go to chat list and start designing. Let's give this container a class of flex1 so that it has a full space. And here we're going to use a flat list component to show a list of all the users, and the data for this flat list will be the users. And let's add the content container style flex1 and a padding vertical of 25. Now let's add a key extractor. For now we'll just use a random value, so for that we will just add math.random function, and we need to hide the vertical scroll bars, so let's add vertical scroll indicator to false. And for the item, let's use render item property, and here we will have the item and the index, and we will return a component chat item. So let's go to our components and create this component chat item.js, and let's create a functional component and save it. Now let's import it here, and we're gonna pass the item data. So let's have a property item as the item, and let's close it. Now let's close the flatlist component and save it to see if we have any errors. Okay, so we can see three items, and these are coming from our dummy data. So if I go to home, you can see we have the dummy data. That's why we are seeing three chat items. Let's also add the index property to chat item in case if we need it. Now let's go to chat item, and here we will receive the item property, which will be the user. Now let's remove this, and here we will have a touchable opacity component, and inside this we're going to have an image of the user. For now, we will just use a dummy image from our assets. So let's add that. Go into assets, images, and avatar.png. And for the style, let's use our HP function to give this a height of HP. We haven't imported it, so let's go to sign in and copy this import statement. Let's paste it here, and let's give this a height of HP 6 and an aspect ratio of 1. And let's close it and save it. Okay, we can see 3 dummy images, and these are coming from our assets, as I've already stored all the assets into my assets folder in the images. So this is the image that we're currently showing, but we'll change this later when we get the actual data from Firebase, so don't worry about it. Let's also add a class name to make this image rounded like this. Okay, so after this image, we're going to display the name, the last message, and the time of the message for that user. So let's add a comment. Now we're gonna need to add some classes for the container to make them flex row. So let's add a class name and give this a class of flex row, justify between, margin horizontal of 4, and item center, a gap of 3, and a bottom margin of 4, and a padding bottom of 4. Now to separate this, we are going to add a border bottom. So let's give this a color of neutral 200. Okay, let's save this. It shouldn't look like this, but maybe we need to add the name. So let's add a container for the name and the last message. Let's make it flex 1 and gap of 1. Now here we need to add another container for the name and the time of the message. So let's make it flex row and justify between. Now first we will add the name of the user, so let's add a text component, and here we will just say Nomi for now. Why can't we see it? um, did we misspell the height? No, maybe we should remove this and add a width of HP6. Okay, we can see the name. I don't know why it wasn't working, but it should have worked. So now let's give this name a style of responsive font size of HP 1.8. Now let's add a class name to make it bold. So let's add font semi bold, and for the text color let's use neutral 800. Okay, looks good. Now let's copy this one more time for our time of the message. So let's use 1.6 for the font size, and let's make it font medium. And for the text color let's use neutral 500, and here we will show time. Okay, so here we will show the time of the message if we have the last message. Now under this row we will add the last message, so let's add a style and give it a font size of HP 1.6, and let's also add a class name to make it bold, so let's use font medium, and text neutral of 500, and here we will show the last message. I'm using dummy data for now, but we will replace it once we get the data from Firebase. Now we can see the list, but I don't want to show the border bottom for the last item. So we will need a way to hide this. So let's go to chat list component, and here I will create a property no border. And in this property, we will check if the item is the last item. So let's say if index plus 1 equals to the total length of the users, that means it's the last item. So we're not gonna show the border for the last item. Now let's also pause a router from this component, because we will need it to navigate to message history, and we cannot do this in chat item because every time chat item renders it will declare the router, so that is not a good practice. Now let's indent this and go to chat item, and here we will receive the no border and the router property. Now let's use this no border property, and we have to convert this to backticks. Let's do that here, and let's just copy this border bottom class, and here we need to use the no border property, and if that's true, we are going to have an empty string, otherwise we will show the border bottom. So you can see on the last item we don't have the border bottom and it looks good. Now we're gonna go to home screen and fetch all the users from Firebase. So go to home component and here we're gonna fetch all the users, but before we do that we are gonna check the documentation from Firebase to see how we're gonna do that. I'm showing you this because if you stuck somewhere, you can visit their documentation to see all the implementation. So we're gonna use a snippet like this. We are gonna use a query function that will receive a reference of the collection, and using where function, we can apply a condition to any property. And here's another example that fetches the cities. And if you're curious about the operators, here's the list of all the operators that you can use in where condition. So if you have more questions about this, I will leave the link of this page into the video description so you can check out. Okay, now let's go to our app and first we are gonna need a query. So let's create a constant and import the query function, and this will receive a reference of the collection. So we'll use a users ref. We already did this. If you remember previously, we created this reference into our Firebase configuration. So now we're gonna use that, and here we're gonna create a condition using where function. So we need to fetch all the users except the currently logged in user. So let's make a condition if the user ID is not equal to the user ID of the currently logged in user, and we can get the UID of the user, and this will fetch us all the users except the currently logged in user. So we'll make a query and we will add a where condition where the user UID is not equal to this, and this will fetch us all the users. So based on this query, we're going to call another function to fetch all the data, and the function is getDocs, and we need to pass the query to this function. Let's create a data array to store the documents data, and we're gonna loop through the documents in the query snapshot. Now this is a bit confusing because for each document data we have to call a data function on each document. So let's push all the document data in the data array, and we're gonna console log this data to see if we actually got the data. So got users as data. Okay, so now let's open our terminal and let's refresh our app, and we got the users in the console, and we hopefully should get two users. So we got Jon Snow and we got the other user as Tom. So we're getting the user. Now we can set this user into our state. So let's remove this and set users as data, and now we can remove the dummy data as well. So first it will show the loading and then it will fetch the user and show the users. For now we have two users, but now we need to change the dummy values to real user values. So let's go to our chat list component, and here we need to go to chat item. First let's replace the user image. So let's remove this dummy image and use the URI as the item.profile URL, and let's save this. Okay, we can see the real images of the users. Now we're not gonna use this image component because it doesn't use cache, and we're gonna remove this and use the image component from Expo image. And here we need to add a style for this image. So let's just copy the styles from previous image component, and let's also add a border radius here as well as 100, and let's add a source that will be the item.profile URL. Now we're gonna add a placeholder for this image, so until the real image is load, we will show this blur hash that we used before. And for the fade in animation time, let's use 500 milliseconds, and let's close this and save it. Again, we can see the transition. So we have added the image. Now we're gonna change the name to the username of the item, and let's save this. We can see Jon Snow and Tom. We're gonna leave the time and the last message as it is. We will work on that later. But now we have a list of users coming from Firebase and it does not include the currently logged in user. Now when user presses on this chat item, it needs to open a message history page. So let's have a function open chat room, and here we're gonna push to another route, but we're also gonna pause the item data because we're gonna need it on the chat room page. So path name will be slash chat room, and for the parameters we will pass the item. So let's save it. So this chat room page doesn't exist, and if we click on it we will get an error. So let's go to our app group, and inside this let's create a new file, chatroom.js, add a functional component, and let's change the name to capital chat room. Let's save this. Now it should work. Now let's refresh our app, and if we click on the chat item we move to chat room. Okay, now we need to get this data on the chat room that we passed from the chat list component. So let's create an item, and we can use a hook, use local search params, and this will get us the data that we passed from the router. So let's console log got item and console the item and save it. Okay, so in the console you can see we got the item data, and as we clicked on Jon Snow, so we got his profile, user ID and username. This is very useful because we can use this data to fetch the message history between the currently logged in user and this user, and we can also use this data to display that user in the chat room so that we know who are we talking to in that chat room. So now we're gonna go into chat room section and we are gonna design our header section. We are doing this because this current header has a fixed height. That's why we need to add a custom header. So let's add a class name to our container and give it a full space and a background of white. Okay, now we need to make our fonts in the status bar dark. So let's use the component status bar and give this a style of dark. Now we can see our fonts. Okay, now after this we are gonna add our chat room header component. So we haven't created this yet, so let's go into our components and create a new file, chat room header. Let's create a functional component and save it. Now let's import it here. We will also pass the user to this component that we got from our chat list component so that we can show the user profile and the name on top of the header. And we will also pass the router so that we will have a back button on this header and we can use the router to go back to previous component. So let's use router and pass the router here. Okay, now similar to how we can change the screen options inside a layout component, we can also do that inside the component itself. So all we need to do is import the stack.screen component, and here I can provide options for this component. So let's say if I change the title to empty string and save it, you will see our title is gone and we can change it to however we want, like let's say chat room. And if I save it, you will see chat room, and if I add a username here, we will see the username, but I want to keep it as empty because I want to show the username on the left side. So now I'm going to add another property, header shadow visible to false. This will remove the shadow at the bottom of our header. So let's save it, and the shadow is gone. Now I want to add the content on the left side of the header. So if I do that, it's going to remove the back button as well. And the way we can do it is add a header left property. This will be a function that will return a template. So let's give this container a class name of flex row because we will have the back button and the username and the profile. So let's have a gap of 4. Now let's add a touchable opacity for our back button, and for the icon let's go to Expo vector icons and find an icon. Let's search for chevron. Okay, we can use this icon chevron left from ntypo. So let's import ntypo icons, and name will be chevron left, and the size will be we need to import our responsive library, so let's copy it from SignIn and paste it here. Okay, let's give it a size of hp4, and the color will be gray. So let me type the hash code for that and save it. Okay, we can see our back icon, but it's not working yet. So let's add an onPress method. And we need to get the user and the router properties that we paused from the parent component. And using the router, we need to call a back function that will hopefully take us back to the previous screen. Okay, so let's save this and test this out. Okay, we're moving back. That means it's working. Now after this button, we're going to add another container that will show the user profile and the username. So let's give this a class name of flex row, item center, and a gap of 3. And first we will add the image. So let's use image component from Expo image. And for the source, we're gonna use the profile URL property from user. And remember, this user is from the chat list user. It's not the currently logged in user. So let's add a style and give this a height of HP 4.5, aspect ratio as 1, and let's add a border radius of 100 to make it rounded. Now let's save this. Okay, we can see the user profile, and if we go back and click on any other user, this will show the profile of that user. Okay, it's working. Now after this image, we're gonna add the user name as well. So let's add a text component and give this a responsive font size of HP 2.5, and let's also have a class name to change the color to neutral 700 and the fonts to, let's say, medium. And let's use the user name property on the user, and let's save this. Now we can see the username as well. Now our header left is done. Next we're gonna add the header right, and we're gonna add the video call and the voice call icons here. So let's add the property header right. Now this again will be a function that will return a template. So let's return a view with a class name of flex row and item center and a gap of 8. And inside this view, we're gonna add icons for call. So let's search for call icon, and we're gonna use the ionicons call icon. So let's import the ionicons library, and name will be call, and the size will be, let's say, HP 2.8, and let's use the gray color for this icon, and let's save this and see. Okay, we can see the call icon. Now we're gonna copy this one more time, and that will be for the video call. So let's search for the video. So we have a bunch of icons. Let's see if we have ionicons. Okay, here you can see we have the video cam icon from ionicons. We can use this one. So let's change the name to video cam, and we can see both the icons. Now I want to add a bar at the bottom of this header. We could do this with the default header, but it wouldn't let us to change the height of the header, so that's why we are doing this way. Now for the bar, let's add a view and give this a height of 3, and let's also add a border bottom and give this a color of neutral 300, and let's save it. Okay, we can see the bar. um, let's choose the color neutral 200. Okay, and now it's not very visible, so let's change it back to 300. Okay, now it's good. Now after this, we're gonna add a view that will contain the message history and our input. So let's give it a flex 1 and justify between a background. We will have a very subtle neutral background and overflow visible. And let's close this. Now inside this, we're going to have a container that will show the message history first. So let's add a view for that, and let's give it a class name of flex1. And here we're going to have a component message list. We haven't created this component, so let's go to components and create this new file, message list.js. Create a functional component. Let's save it, and we need to import it here. And we're gonna pass the messages from this component. So let's create a state for the messages, set messages, and initially it will be an empty array. Now let's pass this messages state to this component, and let's save it. Now we can see our message list component, but we'll work on that later. Now we're gonna add a component here that will show the input. So let's create another view and give this a class name of padding top of 2, and let's close it. Now we also gonna have some space at the bottom of this component, and for that we will use the margin bottom. So we will use our responsive library to add margin bottom. So let's go to sign in and copy the import statement for this library, paste it here, and let's give this a margin bottom of HP 1.7, and let's save it. Now inside this view we're gonna add another view that will be a container for our input and the send icon. So let's add a view and give it a class name of flex row and justify between item center and a margin horizontal of 3. Let's add another view for our input, and this will show here because we use justify between for the message list component and this input component. So for the input text, let's add a view and give this a class name of flex row, justify between. Let's add a background of white and a border and a padding of 2. Inside this component, we're gonna add a text input component, and for now we'll just add a property placeholder that will say type message, and we'll close it and save it. Okay, we can see our text component here. Now we need to change the border color, so let's add a class of border neutral 300, and let's save it. Now let's make it rounded as well, so let's add a class of rounded full, and it's rounded now. Now we're gonna have a padding left from the container to the input, so let's add a padding left of 5. Okay, great. Now it's not taking full space, and for that we need to add a class name property on the input, and let's give it a class name of flex1 and margin right of 2 because we're gonna add an icon on the right side. Now let's also add a responsive font size of HP2, and let's save it. Okay, it's looking great. Now after this text input, we're gonna add a touchable opacity, and that will contain our send icon. Let's give it a class name to change the background color and to make it rounded. Let's use the color neutral 200, and let's also add a padding of 2, margin right of let's say 1 pixel, and rounded full. Now inside this we're gonna add the icon, so let's go to our Expo vector icons and search for the send icon. Let's see which icon should I use. Okay, here we can use the feather icon, so let's import feather icons, and we're gonna use the icon send, so let's name it send, and for the size let's use HP of 2.7, and for the color we're gonna use the gray color. Let's close it and save it. Okay, we can see our input and the icon, and I think we should increase the spacing at the bottom, so let's use margin bottom of 2.7. It looks good now. So next we're gonna work on our keyboard avoiding view. So if I open the keyboard, you will see it covers our input and it's not good. Now let's also see if I type a long string, it will fit into the input. So let's type this is a test just to see if the text fits perfectly inside this box. Okay, it works great. Now let's add our keyboard avoiding view. Why did I added this view? Inner view is also the same, so let's just remove this, and we will add the margin horizontal to inner view. Let's remove this as well, and let's add mx of 3, and let's indent it. Now let's save it, and it shouldn't make any change. Not sure why I added this. Now let's add our custom keyboard view as a wrapper around this chat room. So let's import our keyboard view, and let's copy this closing tag and paste it here, and we need to indent this inner code, and let's save it. Now the UI is not looking good, and I know why. So we're gonna go into custom keyboard view, and we're gonna add a flex one to the content container style of the scroll view. So let's add content container style and add flex 1 and save it. Now the view is looking good, but we still have the keyboard issue. So if I open it, it still covers the input. Now to fix this, we're going to add another property in keyboard awarding view, and we will use keyboard vertical offset. And this is basically the distance between the top of the screen to the top of the keyboard awarding view. It can be different in certain situations, but for now I'll use 90. So now if I open the keyboard, now our keyboard pushes the input and it looks great. Now adding these properties has created another issue. So if you remember, we already used this on our sign up and the sign in, and if I open the keyboard on those screens, now you can see we can't really scroll it and the view is not looking good. So because we added keyboard vertical offset and the flex one to the container of the scroll view, that's why it messed up. Now we need to make some changes so that these properties only exist when we are in a chat room. So what is my password? I think this one. Okay, so let's go to our chat room, and here if I open the keyboard, we need to add those properties. So let's use a flag, and based on that we will add these properties to our keyboard awarding view. Let's use in chat, and this will be a boolean. So let's create configuration for our keyboard awarding view as an empty object, and let's also create another object for scroll view configuration, and we will make a condition here to see if we are in a chat. Then we will add these properties. So let's add a property to keyboard wording view configuration as keyboard vertical offset of 90, and for the scroll view configuration we will add our content container style as flex 1. Now we will use this, so let's remove this and spread out all the properties in keyboard awarding view configuration, and let's remove this as well and spread out all the properties inside scroll view configuration. Okay, let's save this, and our design got messed up, and that's because we are not sending this in chat property. So let's go to our chat room and let's add a property in chat as true, and this will fix our UI and hopefully our keyboard will be working as well. Okay, let's also see if the keyboard issue is fixed on the sign up screen. So if I click on any input and open the keyboard, we are still able to scroll through inputs and our keyboard does not cover any input. And that's because we never added in-chat property on the custom keyboard view for the sign in and the sign up, and it's working great. So there can be other solutions to fix this keyboard issue, but I'm using this way because it's very simple and it fixes the keyboard issue on both the Android and the iOS devices. So now we're in a chat room, but we haven't created this chat room. So if I move to Firebase, you can see we only have the users collection, we don't have the rooms. So for that, we will just create a use effect hook inside this component. And inside this, we will call a function that will create a chat room. So let's call this function create room if it doesn't exist. Now let's create this function under this use effect hook. Create room if it's not exist. This will be an async function because we are gonna call the API, and here first we're gonna get the room ID. Now we're gonna use the user ID from both of the users, and this user is the one, let's call it the second user because this is from our chat list, and we already have the currently logged in user. We can get it from our use auth hook. So this will be currently logged in user. Now we're gonna use the user ID from both of these users, and we're gonna create a logic that will create a room ID based on these user IDs, and we're gonna use this user ID to create a room between these two users. So now let's move to our utilities and create this function to get a room ID. Let's call it get room ID, and here we will pass the user ID 1 and user ID 2, and this will create a logic to combine these two user IDs. So let's sort them first. Let's do an array and put all the IDs in here and use the sort function. Now we're gonna combine these sorted IDs with a dash. So let's use join method, and we will join them by this dash. And now we get our room ID and we will return it from here. Now let me explain why we added this logic. So we need to get the same room ID for user 1 and user 2, and in order to do that, let's say the user 1 has the ABC ID and user 2 has the XYZ ID, and this function will always return ABC-XYZ because it will sort them and join them again. So no matter if you're logged in as user 1 or user 2, you will always get the same room ID, and using that room ID you can get the same messages for that person. So I'm sure that was not too confusing. Now let's export this function and use it inside our chat room. So we're gonna call this function here to get the chat room ID, and we're gonna pass the user IDs. So let's first pass the user ID which is currently logged in, and then we will pass the user ID which we clicked on from the chat list. Now we got the user ID. Now we're gonna set this in our database. So let's use the function setDoc. This will create a document inside the rooms collection. And let's use the doc method from Firebase. And this will have the DB variable that we created, and then the name of the collection, which is rooms, and then the ID of this document, which we already have as room ID. And after this reference, we're gonna pass an object that will contain all the data for this document, and we are gonna pass the room ID. And let's also create a created at property when this room was created, and we're gonna use a property timestamp from Firebase, and we're gonna call a function from date. This will let us create a timestamp from current date, and this will hopefully create a document and the collection if it's already not there. Now let's move back and let's save it. And now if I go into any chat room, it will hopefully create a chat room for that user and the currently logged in user. Now let's go to Firebase and refresh, and just wait a bit. Okay, we can see the rooms collection, and inside the room collection we already have a document, and this document was created when we clicked on John's account, and you can see the combined user ID as the room ID. Now moving back, we're gonna create a state for our message text. So instead of state, we're gonna create a reference for the text because updating the reference won't re-render the entire app. So let's go to our text input, and here create a function on change text, and we will set the value to the current value of the text reference. Now this is very useful because on the performance side, it won't render the page again and again if I type any character. So that is very useful. Now next we're gonna handle send message functionality. So for that we need to add an onPress method on this button, and we will create a function handle send message. Now let's create this function, and this will be an async function because we're gonna call the Firebase API, and first we're gonna get the message from the current value of text reference, and we're gonna trim it to remove the spaces, and if we don't have the message we are gonna return from here. Otherwise we're gonna start sending the message. So let's add and try catch block, just so if we catch any errors we will just alert the user with the error. So this will say message, and we will show the error dot message here. Okay, now first we're gonna get the room ID because we will attach the room ID to each message. So we can use the get room ID, and we will just pass the currently logged in user ID and the user ID which we clicked on. So this will get us the room ID. Next we're gonna add a document reference which will be the reference of the document we created while we opened this chat room. So to create this we're gonna use the doc method. We're gonna pass db and the collection name and the ID of the document, which is room ID. Now inside this document we're gonna create another collection for the messages. So let's create a messages reference, and we're gonna use the collection function to create a collection, and we're gonna pass the document reference in which we're gonna create this collection, and name will be the messages. So the way it works is Firebase allows you to create collections inside the documents, and we are doing the same thing. So we will have the messages collection inside each document in the chat room. So we will have the messages collection here for all the messages between these two users. Now that we have the reference for this collection, we can add documents in this messages collection. So let's add a new document using add doc method. We are using this because we're not concerned with the message ID, so Firebase will handle that. We will pass the collection reference, which is the messages, and here we can add the new message data. So let's add the user ID who sent this message, and let's also add the text for this message, which will be the message. And let's add the profile URL, which we can get from the currently logged in user if you want to show that. Let's also add the sender name, which will be the username of the current user. And lastly, we're gonna add the created add property, and let's use the timestamp from date to the current date. Okay, so if we create this document, we will just console log the ID of this new message. So let's say new message ID is the new document dot ID, and save this. Okay, so this should all work as expected, hopefully. Now let me briefly explain what we are doing here. So first, user will type the message and click on the send icon. Then we will get the document reference of the chat room we are in, and inside that document we will have a collection of messages, and in that collection we will create a new document which will be the new message, and we will console log the message ID. So let's try to send the message to John. Let's say, hey John, and let's send this message. Okay, so we can see a new console log in the terminal, and that says new message ID, which is this. So that means our message was added successfully, and to see it we need to go to Firebase and let's refresh. Okay, so we can see the messages collection inside the document, and we have one item in that. And here we can see all the message data that we passed. Hey John, sender name Nomi. You can add more data to this object by just simply adding more properties here, like if user has seen the message or not. So there is one issue left, which is this message should be cleared when we click on the send icon. So for that, what we're gonna do is create a reference for this input. So let's add input ref, use ref as null. Now we're gonna use this reference on this input, because if we were using the state, then it was very easy to clear the message, but we're using the reference. So we're gonna clear the value from the text reference, and that won't clear the value from the input. So that's why we're using input reference, and we're gonna use the clear function on this reference to clear the value inside the input. So let's save this and try this one more time. Let's send a message to Jon Snow, and here I'll say how are you, and hit send. So the message is being cleared, and we got the new message ID in the console. So now we're gonna add a hook that will fetch all the messages from the messages collection inside this room. So let's first get the room ID using the get room ID function, and we'll pass the user ID 1 and user ID 2, which is on the item object. And now we will create the same reference of the document. This is the reference of this chat room object. So we'll pass the database, rooms collection, and the room ID. And again, we will need to add a reference of the messages collection. And we're gonna add this hook on this messages collection so that if any update happens in that collection, we will get the results. Now we can only use this message reference as well, but I'm going to use a query because we're gonna fetch all the documents in an ascending order, and to do that we're gonna use the order by function from Firebase. So we are passing the messages reference from which we are querying the data, and now I'm going to use the order by, which will take the property and the order. So we are going to order by created add in an ascending order. So now we have the query, and we're gonna use that hook, and that hook will return as an callback function to unsubscribe it, and hook is called on snapshot. And here we're gonna pass the query, and It will fetch all the results based on the reference that we are using, and it will return us a snapshot. So the second parameter will be a callback with that snapshot, and this will include all the messages as the documents. So let's return this function because this needs to be cleared as the component unmounts. So in this snapshot callback, we're gonna loop through all of the documents and we will return the data from all the documents. So let's use the map method on the documents, and we will get the data for each document on the data function. So we'll return that. Now we have all the messages, so let's set them into messages state. So now what will happen is every time we make a change to this collection or add any data into this collection, this hook will trigger and we'll get all the documents on this snapshot and we'll set them into messages state, and we can use this to display our messages. Now hopefully this should set all the messages, and to see it we are gonna console log it here, messages, like this, and let's save it. Okay, so we got a console log in the terminal, and here you can see we got all the messages. And I think we sent two messages, so we're getting the two messages in an array. We got the sender name, text, the user ID. Now we can use this data to display all the messages into the message history component. So let's remove this console and let's add these messages to our message list component, which we're already doing. So let's move to message list and receive all the messages here. Now here we can use a flat list to display all the messages, but I've used it before and got an error because I was using scroll view inside the keyboard avoiding view before. So this is kind of a nested situation. So we will use scroll view and that will work just fine. So let's hide the vertical scroll bars for this component, and we will add a padding top using our content container style. So let's add a padding top of, let's say, 10, and inside this we're going to loop through all of the messages. So let's use map method, and this will return us a callback with message and the index, and here we will return a message item component. So we haven't created yet, so let's move to our components and add this component, message item. Let's create a function component and let's save it. Now here we can import this component, and for now we'll just send the message data, and let's close it and save it. And we can see the two message items that we already sent to Jon Snow. So to remove this warning, we're gonna add the key property as an index on this component. Now we're also gonna use the current user data here, because based on that we're gonna show all the current user messages on the right side. So we already have the user property from our auth context, so let's pass it here as the current user, and we will receive it in the message list component, and then again we need to pass it on the message item. Now let's save it, and we're gonna move to message item and receive these properties. We have the message data and the current user. Now if you remember, while adding the message we added the user ID who sent this message. Now based on that user ID we're gonna add a condition, so that if the user ID from current user matches the message.user ID, that means the current user sent this message, so this is my message, and we're gonna return a view for that to show on the right side. So let's add a view and give this a class name of flex row, justify end to move to the right side, and margin bottom of 3 and margin right of 3 as well. Now let's close it, and inside this we're gonna add another view to give this container a width of 80%, and for that we're gonna use our responsive library. So let's import this library from SignIn component and paste it here. So let's use WP of 80, so that this view will have the 80% width. And inside this let's add a text component, and inside this we're gonna add the text property from our message, and let's save this. Okay, we can see our two messages that we sent to Jon Snow. Now these messages needs to be on the right side, so let's wrap this text inside another container, and let's add a class for flex and self end to move to the right side, and padding of 3. We also need to make it rounded, so let's use rounded to Excel and background of white, and let's close it. Now let's copy our text component and paste it inside this like this, and let's remove this and save it. Okay, we can see our messages on the right side, but why is the padding not working? I'm sure it must be some cache issue. So now we're also gonna add the border around these messages. So let's add a border class, and for the border color let's use border neutral of 200. Let's save it. Okay, we got our padding and the border. Now let's also add a responsive font size of HP 1.9. Okay, great. Now all the messages from my side will show on the right side, and if John sends a message, they should show on the left side. So next we're gonna add a template for that. So let me log out from my account, and we're gonna log into John's account. Let's add a password and hit sign in. Okay, so let's go to Nomi, and we fetch the messages, but we can't see it because I'm logged in as Jon Snow. So to see the messages, let's add an else part to this if condition, and let's just return a text view, and we will just simply add message.text to see the messages, and we'll see the messages that I sent from my other account to Jon Snow. Now you can see the messages. Now we're gonna design it, so let's remove it and add a view, and this view will have the width of 80%, and this will show on the left side. So let's give it WP of 80%, and let's add a class name for margin left of 3 and margin bottom of 3 as well. And inside this let's add another view, and let's add a class name of flex and self start to show on the left side, padding of 3, padding horizontal of 4, and rounded to XL. Now inside this we're gonna add the text component that will show our message.text property. So we can see our messages on the left side. So let's add a background color for the messages. Let's use indigo 100, and let's save it. Great. Now let's also add a border of indigo 200. Why can't we see it? We need to add a border class as well. Okay, we can see the border. Now let's also add a responsive font size to this text component, and let's use HP of 1.9. Let's save it. Okay, they're looking great. So now we have added the template for the left and the right side messages. So if I type anything in here now, this will show on the right side. So let's say I am good, how are you, and let's send. Okay, we can see the messages on the left side, and what happened is when we sent the messages, our hook in the chat room, so where is chat room? Here. Okay, so when we sent the messages, our hook got triggered and we got all the messages in the messages collection, and we set the messages, so that's why we are seeing the new message here. So every time we send or receive any message in that chat room, this hook will trigger and it will load all the messages for each user. So let's comment this, and now I'm going to open the Android app. So let me just go to console, and here if I just type a, this will open the app on Android. So this is opening on my other screen, so let me just drag that simulator here, and we need to rebuild, so let's press R, and this is going to rebuild the app for iOS, sorry, Android. Let's make it big until this loads. Okay, we can see our sign-in component. So this is the first time we're using this app on Android, so let's see if everything works. So I'm going to log in with Nomi. Let's use the password and hit sign in. Okay, it's working great. Now if I open Jon Snow, we got all the messages and the UI is looking great, and our keyboard view is working as well. Now let's type a new message here, I'm good, and let's send it. Okay, we can see our message here, and if I move to iOS, we can see the message in there as well. Let's minimize this iOS simulator, and let me just drag that here so that we can test the messaging on both the platforms side by side. Now on my side, let me just ask a question. When is the Game of Thrones season 8 coming, and let's send it, and we will immediately see it on the other side. And let's just type a reply here from John. um, let's say I know nothing, bro. And if I send it, we will see it on both sides. And all of this is happening through the magic of this snapshot hook that we use from Firebase. So this gets triggered every time we add a document in the messages collection. So that's why messages are being updated for both the users, and we can see all the messages into the messages collection in this chat room. And we can chat with other users, and that will create a separate chat room for me and for that user. So if I type a new message for Tom, hey Tom, how are you? Now that will create a separate chat room for me and Tom, and it will put all the messages in that chat room. So let me just log out from John's account, and I will log in with Tom account. Let me just add a password and hit sign in. Okay, now if I go to Nomi, it will list all the messages between our chat room so that we can see, hey Tom, how are you? Now let's return a reply. I'm good, how are you? Have you seen Jerry? And let's send. We can see it on the other side. So let's add some messages from my side. I'm good, and I haven't seen Jerry. Okay, so our messaging system is working very smoothly, and as you can see, if I just type the message and click on the send icon, it instantly appears on the second user screen. And this is just one of the ways to implement Firebase messaging into React Native. I'm sure there must be other ways to have a structure like this, but I'm using this way because I found it very easy to understand, and if you are a beginner, you will find this easy too. I hope this is not confusing for you because I tried to explain it in an easy way. So now we're gonna add the last message and the time of the message, and for that we're gonna use the same APIs that we used for fetching and sending the messages. So here is the code, and I'll just copy this use effect hook, and we're gonna paste it inside our home section where we are displaying the chat items. So let's go to chat list, and inside the chat item, let's paste it here, and we'll just import all of the things that we used inside this. Let's import use effect, and we don't need this because we won't be creating the room here again. Let's import get room ID, and for the user we need to have the current user here. So let's go to our home section, and we need to pass the current user to this chat list user, and let's pass the user. We already have this from our auth context, so it's all good. Let's save this. And let's get this value inside our chat list, and we need to pass it to our chat item component as current user. We are doing this because we need this current user and the chat item to create the room ID, and based on that room we can listen to all the messages inside that room. So here, instead of user.user ID, we'll use current user.user ID, and we're already passing the item.id, which is a second user, and the order of these IDs does not matter because that room ID will always return the same room ID. Now let's import dog and the db variable, and this will return a reference of that room using this room ID. Let's also import the collection function because this will create a reference of the messages collection inside that chat room. So for the query, let's import the query function, and we're already passing the message reference and need to import the order by. Now for the last message, we're gonna use the descending order so that we get the last message as the first object. So we'll use that. Now here we're getting all the messages and setting all the messages here, but we only need to set the last message here. So let's have a state, and we'll call it last message and set last messages. And the default value for this will be undefined, and I'll explain why I'm using this. So let's put a semicolon and remove this. Now here we are going to check if we have the first item on the last messages. That will mean it's a last message, so we'll set that. Otherwise we're going to set it as null. Now if it's undefined, that means we're still loading the messages and we'll show a loading state. And if it's null, that means we loaded the messages but we couldn't find the messages on Firebase. So we can use that to display the loader. Now let's just console log this last message to see if we are actually getting the messages. Okay, I think we forgot to import this hook, so let's import on snapshot and let's save it. Okay, we don't see any error, and in the console log we can see the last message as null. Okay, so first it was undefined because we were loading the messages, and then we got the last message. Now we can use this data to display the last message for each user. So let's comment this out first, and let's scroll down to see the time and the last message. Okay, so here we need to remove this, and let's create a function to render the time. And for the last message, let's also create another function, render last message. Now let's create these functions. Let's place them here. Now let's create render time, and for now we'll just return a string from here, time. We'll work on that later. Now for our last message, we will create a function render last message, and here we will check if the type of the last message is undefined. That means we are still loading the messages, and in that case we're gonna return a string that will say loading. So let's return loading here, and after this we're gonna make another check to see if the last message is null or not. So let's use if statement. If we get the last message, we will show it. Otherwise we will return a message like say hi to this user. Let's use the hand emoji. Now inside this if statement, we will also check if this message was sent by the current user or the second user. So let's use current user dot user ID. If it matches to the last message dot user ID, that means I sent this message, and in that case we're gonna append a u on this message, because this way user can tell by looking at the chat list that I sent this message. So after you, we'll use the text property from the last message, and if I did not send this message, I'll just render last message dot text. Okay, let's save this, and render time does not exist. I think we created it. Okay, it should be render time, not render item. Okay, we see the loading and then we see the messages, but for Jon Snow it says say hi because we haven't sent a message to him. So here if I send the message to Nomi, it will say you send this. So let's say okay cool, and if I send it and go back, here you can see it updates and says you, that means we sent this message. Now let's send a message to Jon Snow and see what happens. Hey Snow, have you seen Jerry? Now if I send this message, this will update the chat list item last message as well. So if I go back, now it says you sent this message. Okay, it's working. Now let me minimize this and we will test this on both Android and iOS. So if I go to Nomi, and here I'll just type test and hit enter, and now it updates the chat list item instantly and we see the last message, and it works from Android side as well. So if I go back from this and open this account and let's send a message. Okay, we see another issue here. When we open the keyboard, it should push all the messages so that we can see the last message. But don't worry about it, we will fix this later. For now, let's just send a message from here. Let's say test2 and hit send. And we see the message updated on the other side. Now we also have this keyboard issue on iOS. So if I open the keyboard, it does not push all the messages. And because we're using a scroll view, it should scroll down to the last message. And we also have one more issue with this keyboard view, and we can't see it now, but when we have a lot of messages inside a chat room and we try to send a new message, it should also scroll down to that new message, and by default I don't think it will do that. So if I send a new message like say test3 and test4, we'll keep sending messages until the messages reach the keyboard view. So test6 and test7. Okay, so now we can see the problem I was talking about. When we send the new message, it should scroll down so that we can see this new message. By default, it's not doing that, and if I open the keyboard, it should scroll down to see the last message. And same thing happens on the Android side. If I open this chat room, it should scroll down to see the last message, and same if I open the keyboard. So don't worry about it. We have a solution for this, and we need to go to our chat room. And here, if we get the message or we send the message, we need to scroll to the end of the scroll view. And what we can do is add a reference to this scroll view, and using that reference, we can scroll to the end of this scroll view. So now we're gonna do that. Let's go to chat room, and here let's create a reference, scroll view reference, and use the useRef hook as null, and we'll pass this reference to this chat list component, sorry, message list. Let's pass it here, and let's go to this component, and we will use the reference to this scroll view. Now that we have a reference of this component, we can scroll to the bottom of this component using a function. So let's move to our chat room, and here we need to create a function. Let's create it here. Let's call it update scroll view, and inside this function we're gonna use a set timeout, because when we are scrolling down there might be some messages being updated somewhere, so we need to add a little delay. So let's use 100 milliseconds. Now using the reference of this scroll view, we can call a function to go to the end of the scroll view, and the function name is scroll to end. And here we're gonna pass a property animated as true so that it animates while scrolling down. Now we can use this function when we are setting the messages here. So we can either do that here or we can create another use effect. So let's create another use effect. And we need to call this function every time our messages gets updated. So if we fetch the messages or we send the message, this will be called every time, and we will scroll down to the bottom. Now if I save this, we will scroll down automatically, and that happens when the messages gets updated. So if I open the chat room again, we scroll to the bottom of the scroll view, and that will happen on the Android side as well. So if I open the chat from Tom, we see it scrolls down and it has this animated effect. But you can turn off this animation by simply setting it to false. And now we no longer have this animation effect, and if you open a list, it will already be at the bottom. But I like the scrolling animation, so let's make it true. But you can set it to false if you don't like the animation. So now we have fixed this situation, but we haven't fixed this keyboard issue. So if we open the keyboard, it still does not pushes our messages, and for that we need to add a listener on this keyboard. So whenever the keyboard is in the view, we will again call this function. So let's create a constant keyboard did show listener, and we need to import the keyboard from React Native and add a listener. And this event will be keyboard did show. So whenever the keyboard is in the view, we will again call this function update scroll view so that it scrolls down to the very end of the scroll view. So now we need to remove this keyboard listener as well. So let's return a function here. This will be called whenever the component unmounts. So we need to move the unsub call here as well. Let's call it here. This will remove the on snapshot hook, and we can remove the listener by using remove function like this, and let's save it. Okay, it's pushing all the messages. That's because the keyboard is in the view. So if I open the keyboard again, it will push all the messages until we see the last message. It's not basically pushing all the messages, it's scrolling down in the scroll view until we see the last message, and that will happen on the Android side as well. If we open the chat, it will scroll down, and if we open the keyboard, it will scroll down until we see the last message. And now if I send the new message and hit send, it will again scroll down to see this last new message, and we can see this new message on the other side, and we can open and it scrolls down. Okay, so it's all working great. We forgot to include the time of the message for the last message, so let's go to chat room. Sorry, chat item, and here we have a function render time. And first I'm going to show you what kind of data we are getting for the date of the message. So if we have the last message, we'll just console log the created add property. So let's say last message time will be last message dot created at, and let's save it. And in the console you can see we got the last message time and it says nanoseconds and the seconds. So we need a way to convert this second to a user friendly date. So for that I will go to our utilities, and here I'll just paste a function that will convert this time. So this takes a date and it will get the day, and then we'll append a month name. So we have all the 12 months here, and this will return us in a nice format. So we'll show this as the time of the message. So let's go back, and here first we need to get the date from this last message, and that we can get from the created add property. Now we will return this format date function, and we need to pass a new date, and to create this date we need to multiply the seconds with 1000 because it takes milliseconds. So let's multiply it by 1000. Now we don't need to return the time string, so we can just remove it, and let's save it. Okay, we can see the time of the last message 13 January, which is the time of recording this video, and this will appear on the Android side as well. So if we go back to chat items, we can see 13 January. So hopefully we have covered all the features. Now let me just minimize this to test them again side by side. Let's move them here. Okay, so first we have created this beautiful UI, and then we have this context menu which works on both Android and iOS. Now let's sign out, and we have this sign in page and sign up page. So let's go to sign up and create a new account. Here we have implemented the keyboard avoiding view. So no matter how many inputs you have, this won't conflict with the keyboard view. Now let's create a new user. Let's say Will Smith, and the email will be will@gmail.com. Let's use a password, and for the profile URL let's find a profile image. We'll just use this one. So let's copy the URL and paste it here and hit sign up. Okay, we are logged in and we can see all the users in the app. We can't see it here because we haven't added a listener on the users collection, but you can do that, and this will update the list instantly as we create the user. But for now I'll just update the Android app to get this new user. Okay, we got the new user, but why does it say the email? It should be username. I think we mistakenly added the email instead of username. So let's just go to Firebase and we will check quickly. Go to users, and yeah, I think we added the email. So let's just remove it and just say will and update it. Now this won't automatically update here, so we need to reload the Android app again. Okay, it's loading and it's fixed. So if you haven't sent any message, it will say hi to send the message. Now let's send a message from Will to Nomi. Let's say hi, and it instantly updates in the chat list. And if we open it, we can see the updated message. So let's reply from here. Hey man, how are you? And if I hit send, it will update on both the sides. And let's reply from here. I'm good, and hit send. It will update on both sides. So this is how the chat system is working, and we have made it in a way that it creates a single chat room between the two users, and it will keep all the messages in that chat room. So we're not using a single collection for messages and storing all the user messages in there. That is not preferred. Also, we have fetched these users in a way that it doesn't include the currently logged in user. So if we open Jon Snow here, we have implemented keyboard avoiding view, and we have made it so that the input stays on top of the keyboard even if we open the keyboard or it's closed. And we have implemented the scrolling feature where if you open the keyboard it will scroll down so that we see all the messages. So if I open the keyboard, you can see it's happening, and if I open the keyboard on iOS, it scrolls down so that we see the last messages. The only thing we haven't done is this profile view, which is in the context menu, and I'll leave this up to you guys so you can come up with creative ideas and create a profile view for every logged in user. With this, our project is complete and we have learned about Firebase authentication. We have created this messaging system using Firestore, and we have created this beautiful UI with Tailwind CSS and vector icons, which is fully responsive by the way. Also, we have fixed a lot of keyboard issues as well. If you find this project helpful and you have learned something from this, then do like it and share it with your friends. If you still have any questions about anything, you can ask them into the comment section and I'll try to answer them as soon as possible. So, see you in the next one.